Good afternoon and welcome to our New York Archives Magazine online speaker series. Today, we're joined by author Dr. Edward Countryman, Head of Researcher Services Dr. James Folts, and State Archivist Tom Ruller for a discussion about the completion of the Save America's Treasures grant project from the National Park Service and the Institute of Museum and Library Services. The project helped conserve and digitize historical court records and other important documents of the Revolutionary War era that document, among other things, enemies of the state or those charged with treason against the new nation. Dr. Edward Countryman is a University Distinguished Professor of History at Southern Methodist University. Dr. Countryman has written extensively on the Revolutionary era in the United States and is the author or co-author of several books. He won the prestigious Bancroft Prize in 1982 for his study of the American Revolution in New York. His 1985 book, The American Revolution, is a concise yet thorough study of the revolution that has been used widely in schools and colleges. In addition, he's written over 100 articles, essays, review essays, and reference book contributions, together with book reviews in professional journals and newspapers such as the New York Times and the Washington Post. He has published both print and broadcast journalism in the US and abroad. Dr. James Folts has been the head of researcher services at the New York State Archives since 1992. Dr. Folts has written and lectured extensively on New York State history, especially the history of the New York State courts. He authored the publication Duly and Constantly Kept, A History of the New York Supreme Court and an Inventory of its Records, which received the Society of American Archivists Philip M. Hamer and Elizabeth Hamer Keegan Award for Archival Advocacy. He is a fellow of the New York Genealogical and Biographical Society and is a fellow of the Academy of New York History. Tom Ruller has been New York State Archivist since 2015. Tom has been an active professional and is the author of several peer-reviewed journal articles and reviews on the use of technology in archives and the preservation of records in electronic form. He's been a consultant for several state governments and other organizations focusing on electronic records management and preservation. I am pleased to introduce and to welcome Dr. Edward Countryman, Dr. James Folts, and Tom Ruller.
Well, thank you, Josie, and thank you to all of you and to my colleagues, the panelists on today's program. This is an exciting topic for us, and especially because it brings to light some really important records that we recently brought into the state archives. In 2017, we acquired a large collection of historical court records from the New York County Clerk's Office. We're going to talk a little bit about those in a few minutes. At the State Archives, we preserve the official records of New York's colonial and state governments, 26 miles of material that tell the story of New York, tell the story of its citizens, its communities, and all the things that make this state wonderful. I think one of the things that we in the archives business do most valuably is provide context for the records and documents that we preserve and make available. And these records are no exception. So I'd like to start our conversation off today with a question about the context in which these records came from. Can you characterize, Dr. Countryman, we'll start with you, characterize the situation in New York during the war? Were there many loyalists outside of New York City?
Certainly glad to try to start this great conversation. And before I do, let me add that I grew up in the Albany area, and virtually it is nice to be back. Having said that, I see New York at the point of independence and afterwards as torn apart. I mean, there's an old line from John Adams that the task of the colonies was to glide insensibly into statehood. And I thought that when I started the work that became my first book, my dissertation, and then my first book. And I was wrong. That I kept finding in New York, in the evidence that I accumulated at the state archives and in places all over the state and down in the city, lots of evidence that the state had been ripped, that it had been sundered, to use the verb that I used in chapter 4 of the book that Josie referred to. Sundered how? Well, as of the autumn of 1776, the lower district, the southern district, was in the hands of the British. And as far as an awful lot of people on Staten Island and Manhattan and Western Long Island were concerned, that was absolutely fine. They had not been involved in the revolutionary movement. They had really repudiated it. But there's more than that. Vermont, of course, was tearing itself free, and New York State did not regard that as in any sense a good idea. As far as it was concerned, it was a pretended state. And the people of Vermont were revolted subjects of this state. So that's the second split. Third split is that although war had not yet broken out in the Western country, it was on the way. And Native people, particularly Iroquois, were arguing among themselves just as surely as anybody else about which side to choose, because this was one of those terrible times when you had to choose a side. And Lord help us if we have to live through such a time. And there are records of all of this sort of thing. And there's a particularly poignant one that I keep coming back to, which happened up in the Helderberg, up behind Albany, where a bunch of farmers gathered to debate what to do, and they were not sure. And some of them were for the British, and some of them were for the Americans. And the guy who was presiding, whose name was John Commons, put the question: if you're for the king, stay here. The Redcoats will show up. If you're for Congress, go down to Albany and join up with the American war effort. But as for myself, I don't know what to do. And we know what he said, because there was a spy among them. And there were, in fact, spies everywhere, spying on everybody, because the whole thing was disjoint. And the whole thing, as I said earlier, was torn to pieces. It was really quite sundered. Though, with that in mind, who were these people? Were they loyal British? Were they Vermonters? Were they native people who had the strange idea that the Western country was theirs and theirs alone, and neither the British nor the Americans nor the French really had anything to say about it? So it was a time of choice, voluntary choice or forced choice. I'll make one further point on this count, that it also was a time of choice for Black New Yorkers. Essence of slavery was that you had no choice. You do what you were told at the penalty of maybe your life or being sold south or some other horrendous fate. And living in Texas, I could say that was a horrendous fate to be sold south. And I'm being not completely flippant. But the revolution did break the domination of the white race open. And it did become possible for Black people, and there were many, of course, in New York, to choose which side are we on, what is best for us. That's how I would summarize the situation, that it was completely split. Maybe I could make one last point on this count. People have heard of Alexander McDougall, general, and before that, street radical. McDougall Street in New York is named for him. And I recall a letter that he wrote, I think it was to Governor George Clinton, saying that the British now have the Southern District, Vermont is gone. The majority of our counties are now not loyal to the state government at all. And if they get a few more of our counties, they can undo independence. So that's how bad it was.
Wow. Wow. Thank you very much for that. Because again, context is everything. And when you look at these records, it's citizen against citizen and talking about each other. And that sundered term almost seems absolutely perfect, especially when you look at the records and the way people are talking about one another. Maybe we can talk a little bit about the records. Jim, I think you've got a PowerPoint that you might be able to walk us through what these records are that we've preserved and what we've done with them. And then maybe what can they tell us about loyalists that we don't already know. So if we can bring up that PowerPoint, I think that would be really helpful.
Folks, this is what the documents look like. Over 200 years after they were created in the 1770s and 1780s by the revolutionary government of the new state of New York. Of course, in exile, in fugitive status, because as Ed said, New York City and Long Island were occupied by the British Army. These documents have seen the test of time and been found wanting because of poor storage conditions, bad environment, and really neglect by their custodians in New York City for over 200 years. Over 200 boxes like this contain scattered among them over 2,000 documents relating to loyalists under the statute, enemies of the state. Most of the documents relate to ordinary civil litigation and routine criminal prosecutions, but within them is an important new source of information about New Yorkers, both patriots and loyalists during the Revolutionary War. Let's see the next slide. This is an example of an unfolded document. You see the endorsement, people of the state of New York, a new concept in a culture that recognized the king as the source of authority. It's against, as you see, multiple plaintiffs, John Monroe, and in fact, about 40 others. It was a mass indictment of men who had shown loyalty to the Crown of Great Britain, in most cases by furnishing supplies and even service to General Burgoyne's army as it was marching slowly, sailing, then marching southward from Montreal toward Albany in the summer of 1777. There were patriots who observed these men give aid and comfort to the enemy. And the multiple pages underneath are the depositions of those witnesses against the treasonous activities of their compatriots. Next slide. If you want to see these documents in living color, you go to the New York State Archives website, digital collections. All of the documents we're talking about have now been conserved in a special laboratory in Philadelphia, returned to the state archives with digital surrogates. They can be accessed and searched and examined, printed out, downloaded through our website. And this is the home page with the URL. Next slide. This is the sort of title of the large collection, much larger collection of court documents from which these loyalist documents, indictments, depositions, and so on were found. This is Archives Talk. That's how we organize records and describe them. This creating entity was the state Supreme Court, which still exists today as the state's major trial and appellate court. This is a huge collection of pleadings, which are statements by opposing parties, as well as other civil and criminal case documents. Next slide. And if you click on the link in the previous slide, this is what you see as examples. You can search by name of defendant, like George Boyles or Jacob Frost or Samuel Brownson. And where there are multiple defendants, as in the first example I showed, John Monroe and 40 others, you can search under all those names. Most of these people left the state at the end of the war and migrated to either Nova Scotia or what is now Ontario. Next slide. Here's an example of a particular loyalist from Tryon County, renamed, it was named for the last royal governor, renamed Montgomery County, located now in the Mohawk Valley. And Christopher Servos was a member of the Butler's Rangers, named for a prominent loyalist associate of Sir William Johnson, who died in 1774. And they, with Iroquois, who were allied with the Crown during the war, raided the frontier settlements of New York and caused great damage. Servos was detected in his treasonous activities. There is a deposition by, I can't even read it, on the right there, and another one on the left by Andrew Pettis, I believe it is, no, Andrew Ritter. Servos was indicted and convicted in absentia as an enemy of this state. Next slide. Another example, Nicholas Dean of Orange County. This is the indictment by Jeremiah, signed by Jeremiah Coleman, foreman of the grand jury in Orange County. which found the indictment against Dean. Nicholas Dean was not a patriot. He was a loyalist. He fled to New York City, had fought for the British in New Jersey, went back to New York City, and Jeremiah Coleman had been captured by the British. And he worked for the British Army down in the city, and he observed Nicholas Dean as proprietor of a popular tavern frequented by redcoats. And Jeremiah Coleman testified, deposed before the grand jury in Orange County. This guy, Nicholas Dean, is a traitor. This is where I saw him engage in those activities. And this is the true bill indicting Nicholas Dean. That's the end of the show. Here we are to the live presenter.
Well, thank you, Jim. I mean, these documents are fascinating, and you've given us a really tiny little sample of what they contain and what they're all about. But I guess my question is, what do these documents about loyalists tell us that we didn't already know before?
May I come in?
Please.
Okay, well, I wish I had had these documents when I was writing A People in Revolution, which is my New York book. I mentioned earlier that I've got a chapter, no, I didn't mention this. Chapter 4, I think, is called Rebels, Royalists, and Frightened Men. And what these documents would have aided me in doing was getting at the humanity of all of these people stuck in a very terrible situation. I was able to do that when I wrote that book because there was plenty of printed material that fits nicely with what Jim has just described with these manuscripts that are now, of course, digitized and available. And I'm thinking of, say, the records of the Albany County Committee, which include that meeting up in the Helderberg and include the activities of their spies to find out who was not really with them. And I'm thinking also of the records of the commissioners for detecting and defeating conspiracies. And if that is not a scary title, I don't know what is, because these guys were political police. That's the way they worked. Perhaps the most famous example of detecting and defeating a conspiracy was the Hickey plot in New York to capture George Washington himself, and that led to the execution of some of the people that were involved. But there's a lot more. And as I worked through those records for Albany County, for down lower in the Hudson Valley, and for Western New York, I was watching what I described earlier, a place that is coming absolutely to pieces. Now, as Jim said, most of these people ended up in Canada. And thanks to these records, we get maybe a more detailed or specific sense of who these people were. I'm thinking here of Alan Taylor's Divided Ground, where he describes these people as late loyalists, or some of these people as late loyalists. Well, who and why? Where did they come from? We don't know from these records, at least as far as I can tell from the ones that I've been able to go through, and I haven't been able to go through them all. But we don't know whether some little war about religion or some dispute within a town in Orange County or in Ulster County or what would have led each of these people, at least we don't know from these records, but each of them has a context. And doing social history is difficult stuff. You have to search for the grain. You have to search for the tiny little bit of information that's really helpful. So we've got here a kind of ritualized process repeated again and again and again. But as in perhaps trying to listen to a Philip Glass opera, the tiny little bit difference will be the thing that actually gives you significant information that you really need. So by themselves, what they show is a process that I think comes fairly late on the question of dealing with loyalists, because these are documents that really were prepared for cases that would go before the courts. But that presumes there is a set of courts. And in the interregnum, in between the collapse of the old royal government and the, I won't say creation, but rather institutionalization of the new state government, it's in between. So, but here we've got, I think, an additional bit of information to what you would find in the actual records of courts and what you would find in the records of the conspiracies commissioners. So you're getting a picture here of the process of shifting from the old to the new, which was not easy at all. By itself, it's great to have these. And if I had had these when I wrote A People, I could have written a richer account than I did. But all answers to all questions beget new questions. So these records were discovered and recognized as very valuable, and now are digitized thanks to the effort of people like Jim, now available. Well, what new questions now do emerge? I don't think they changed the big picture, that New York was riven, torn apart, that there were loyalists in many, many, many places, and that shows up in these records, for instance, around Hoytsboro, Skeensboro, at the bottom end of Lake Champlain. And it shows up on the lower west bank of the Hudson River in Orange County and maybe in Ulster. And it shows up in Albany, and it shows up on the Western Country. Well, we get some sense of where these people were. That leaves me puzzling, why? Why has this world come apart? Which it definitely has.
Wonderful, thank you. You've mentioned some of the other sort of legal organizations or government organizations that were checking on loyalists and sort of, I'll say, prosecuting them. And wasn't there a process in New York where the lands of loyalists were forfeited after the war?
I can answer that.
And I can too, but you go first.
Okay, I'll go and then you go. Ed refers to the early stage of the war when revolutionary committees, almost vigilance committees to detect conspiracies were active throughout the Patriot-controlled part of the state. But New York, by its bootstraps, you might say, the Patriots of New York created a new state government with a constitution in 1777. And very soon after that, the new state legislature institutionalized a draconian process for indicting, trying, convicting enemies of this state. The so-called Forfeiture Act was enacted in 1779, and it had a dual purpose. As I said a moment ago, not only the indictment of the trial of the conviction of loyalists or enemies of this state, but also sequestration, that is seizure of their property, and eventually forfeiture of their property by sale to the benefit of the new state. This was a near authoritarian exercise of sovereign power. It in fact exceeded the available authority under the English statute of treason. And I'll quickly point out the differences where New York was even more, you could say, authoritarian in its prosecution of traitors. In England, prosecution for treason under an act of 1690, something or other, had to be based on the evidence, depositions provided by at least two persons. The trial of the accused traitor had to occur with that individual in person before a jury. In New York, under the Forfeiture Act, all that was bypassed. Literally, an individual could be convicted as an enemy of this state on the testimony of one witness. And most of the convictions occurred in absentia. Certainly notice was posted in the few newspapers in the new state that, proceedings had commenced. The accused persons did have the right to appear before the Supreme Court, and mostly in Albany. Few did. Most had already fled behind British lines, either to New York City or Canada, and almost all of those accused persons were convicted in absentia and lost their property. This is a sovereign state, self-proclaimed, exercising authority to its utmost.
My turn?
Yes.
Okay, I'll come back here. I'll add to what Jim has said and in no sense argue with it. But let me look a little bit or think a little bit about the Act of 1779. Now, I see that as a response to all the turmoil that was going on, even among the people who regard themselves as loyal New Yorkers and emergingly loyal Americans. I recall somebody writing a letter to Governor Clinton asking him to stop the policy of trying to convert these lost children. and accepted that the time had come to punish them. And Clinton himself responded in one of his messages. It's in 1779. It's to the legislature. And he speaks about the grievances, and I'm roughly quoting, that your constituents so loudly expressed. And what he meant was turmoil. And what he meant was committee action against people. And what he meant was, well, this situation of confusion and of mutual enmity that had developed in the area that still remained to be part of New York. And what he wanted was very much that the people of the state of New York, and who were they? That's a good question. But then who would be the people of the United States? But that the people of the state of New York would declare their power over everybody else. And so the title of the act, if I recall correctly, would be an act for, first of all, attainting 79 named people without trial, outlawing them, leaving them, without the protection of the law at all, and seizing their property. And I recall, after I published to people, getting a letter from somebody who wanted some help in maybe getting that property back. Well, that's been known to happen. I mean, after the fall of the communist regimes in Eastern Europe, a lot of that went on. Property was restored, and there's still dispute about it. This guy had in mind the Upper East Side of Manhattan Island. And I had to say, look, you ain't going to get nowhere on this one. And he clearly did not. But the first part of that act was a direct act of seizure, a bill of attainder, naming people, which is now forbidden by the United States Constitution. And I still don't know whether the framers had New York's action particularly in mind, but they certainly in 1787 did write a forbidding of this kind of legislation. And since Gouverneur Morris of New York was one of the major drafters, chances are pretty good. So we're looking at an influence on the Constitution itself. The second,
add something quickly, Ed.
Yeah, sure.
The first Constitution, in fact, banned use of acts of attainder.
Thank you.
After the war. They allowed themselves to keep using it during the war.
Thank you. Which means that we're talking to the fact that this is a time of violent transition, when the old order has fallen apart and people are going to bootstrap up, and they are in an emergency situation. Absolutely. Now, the second part of the title of that bill was for declaring the sovereignty of the people of the state in respect of all property within the same. And when I was working on my dissertation and then book, I was thinking property of loyalists, and there were plenty of them. Sir William Johnson and people in Manhattan and people up and down the Hudson Valley and all sorts of places. And there was an old dispute, which I don't really pay too much attention to anymore, about whether this represented a social revolution against feudalism, American style, and so forth. I now think that the property really of concern, although I can't prove it, belonged to people from the Oneida to the Seneca. And that what the state was doing was asserting its absolute authority, which it had long, was the province had claimed, but not been able to enforce, over the Indians and over the enormous amount of land that they controlled. And here I would cite the actions of another commission, the one established in 1784, for extinguishing Indian title. I didn't use that when I was writing my first book. Now I see it in quite a different way. So this is a major transformation, and it does involve all sorts of people, and it does involve quasi-legality, in-betweenness, moving towards legality, courts, informal bodies, committees, and so on and so forth. And you read this stuff and you put it together and you realize this was a hell of an upheaval.
Wow, it's a whole other level of scholarship and analysis that these specific records help illuminate.
Absolutely.
You can't, the Constitution of 1777 almost begins the story.
I think it does. Yeah, and let me add this, Tom, that Constitution took quite a long time to take hold. It wasn't a matter of people standing up on overturned beer barrels in Kingston, which on a platform on them, and proclaiming, "Hey guys, we got a Constitution," and then suddenly it's all over. No, not at all. The transition was slow and it was difficult and it was painful.
Well, and as you say, the Constitution of 1777 applied to the parts of the state that the British didn't occupy, which was largely New York City, but also huge chunks of upstate New York, as Burgoyne was still marching down the Champlain Valley at the time that the Constitution was accepted, which was in April.
Yes, true.
So it's just it's fascinating that these records sort of bring out so many other levels. It's not just about people and about loyalists. It's about the maturation of the judicial process.
It is. And it's about which side are you on? And since you mentioned Burgoyne, I noticed when I was reading some of the records, and I have not read them all, that there was a great big cluster of records that tie directly to the invasion from the north. And you can see that people are, well, what do I do? You know, a major army is on its way. Who do I choose? Help.
Right. Well, so we have the situation of Burgoyne's invasion from Canada, which forces these choices among people. But New York City had been occupied by the British since 1776 and so until 1783. So are there very many cases within these records that reflect actions by the state against those people who stayed in New York City?
I could answer generally, but Jim might have more specifics.
You go first.
Okay, my general answer would be that when the British took over in the Southern District, some people stayed and just wanted to continue their lives. And some people were glad to do it because they were happy enough that the British were there, and other people fled. And the response of the state at the point of reunion was to declare to the people that you who stayed, declare to the people who stayed, sorry, that they don't deserve anything. They deserve to be penalized and double taxed and all sorts of things of that sort, and without much procedure. And they also were in a situation where, as you see in these records, one person could point a finger and the next person is up against it. I mean, that's what happens with political policing, you know? In a way, I don't want to confuse New York's revolutionary government with the East German government, but the Stasi did much the same thing. Who's watching whom? And certainly at the end of the armed conflict, there was tremendous antipathy between patriotic people who had moved upstate and those horrible people who had stayed in the city and who might well be open to this kind of accusation. But Jim, you might know more about what the records actually contain.
I can add to that. Many of the prosecutions of enemies of this state, as the statute said, were against individuals who voluntarily removed to New York City. Now, that might not even be for residence. It might be just for trade or visit of family or friends. Yet the mere act of voluntarily going behind enemy lines was sufficient to convict. And there was a lot of that. And we have to remember that the waterways were the real highways of colonial and revolutionary New York. The Hudson River, the great highway north-south of the new state, and Long Island Sound was a busy place full of shipping before the war. And there was a lot of commerce, upstate, downstate, Connecticut to Long Island. And some people got caught up in this, either innocently or deliberately having commerce with the enemy.
Let me add something else now too, that I'm finishing off a course on how filmmakers have interpreted the revolution. And this morning my students saw Hamilton, and people who know New York as a New York lawyer, or Hamilton as a New York lawyer, will remember Rutgers versus Waddington, in which Hamilton stepped in to try to regularize the situation and to defend a person who was accused of misusing the property of an American widow who had fled the zone of British occupation and managed to make his case in the courts. And so now I've managed to get Lin-Manuel Miranda into our scene.
Fantastic. Of course, in all these court cases, there were attorneys. And you mentioned Alexander Hamilton, who was a practicing attorney in New York after the war. Are people like Hamilton and Aaron Burr represented in these records as counsel?
Actually not, Tom.
No.
Because as I mentioned before, most of these convictions occurred in absentia. The defendants never showed up in court. Hamilton was in the Army.
So was Burr.
I don't remember if Burr served in the Army.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. Where Hamilton and Burr and other new attorneys and very few handovers or leftovers from the colonial bar do appear in cases involving patriots and loyalists is immediately after the war. The so-called Trespass Act, 1783, allowed property owners in New York City who were patriots and who had fled the city or Long Island to recover damages incurred by their property at the hands of others, occupants, renters, during the war. Hamilton defended a lot of those cases, built his reputation as a litigator in those Trespass Act cases. Burr, I think in one or two of them actually opposed Hamilton, but Burr was more often generally counsel for the Patriots. Hamilton admired the British judicial system. He admired the common law. He admired property rights, obviously, and he had a sense of justice and also a sense of opportunity for his career. And he helped build that career in these Trespass Act cases.
I think part of Hamilton's project, once he's in the law practice, was to establish the regularity of law as opposed to ad hoc decisions based on what seemed to be the facts as alleged by either the defendant and plaintiff or by maybe some lawyer who's representing the defendant and plaintiff. And I could get off into some details on this that would be irrelevant to our discussion. But what you see in these records that you now have, that you've made available, is kind of a halfway house, because these cases are brought for presentation to the Supreme Court of Judicature. But there's no real trial, that these people are gone. And we're sliding from the complete irregularity of the interregnum after the British government collapses and until the state government is firmly in control. So we're looking here at, well, sliding, I used that word a moment ago, that these are half part of the fantastically disheveled situation that the revolution created. And they're also half part of the new regularity that will take greater and greater form. Thanks in good people, thanks in good part to people like Hamilton.
Well, we've only got time for a couple more minutes before we have to wrap things up, and Josie will come back in a second. But just to summarize, it almost seems like these records are critical for understanding individuals. And one of the individuals you've already mentioned, Sir William Johnson, and then of course his son John, who sued the state until he died to get his property back. But the kinds of people that are reflected in these records aren't necessarily the John Johnsons and the Sir William Johnsons.
Absolutely.
Are they?
Yeah, they're not. Now, one of the things that struck me when I was reading the Conspiracies Commissioner's records is that these are frightened, ordinary people whose lives are going crazy, and they're hauled up now before a revolutionary authority. And the commissioner's records do show neighbors and friends and relatives putting up bond on behalf of these people. But the records that we're talking about today don't show that, because these people are gone. This is an open and shut matter. Accuse, it's over. Don't come back.
I guess I'd like to conclude, Ed, Tom, Josie, by emphasizing the novelty of these records. They had never been used by scholars. We are now getting graduate students who are interested in using them, but they add to the corpus of knowledge about New York and the Revolutionary period. They embody the perspectives of the patriot accusers, as well as the activities of their foes, often neighbors, sometimes even relatives, the loyalists. They are all digitized, the names are indexed, and it's interesting that among the people now finding them on the website are descendants of loyalists who live in Canada. So it's partly for them that we are engaged in this project, and we're pleased to see them used. And if you out there who may be seeing this video have a patriot or a loyalist ancestor, either one, were involved in this tumultuous, terrible time, a time of uncertainty and promise, look at our website.
May I add one more thing that I learned about these when Jim and I crossed paths at a conference in 2017, and the archives had just acquired these records, and he was bubbling over with excitement. And we had a good conversation, I can recall it, and he convinced me, it didn't take too much convincing, that if I had a doctoral student who was going to work on revolutionary New York, down here that's unlikely, but that if I had such a person, this was stuff that they would really need to be looking at. And now I see it realized, and it's a great achievement.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Dr. James Folts, Dr. Edward Countryman, for a fantastic conversation. As always, I learn a lot by listening to really smart people, and this was one of those great examples. So thank you both very, very much. Josie.
Yes, I echo those thanks. Thanks to you, Ed, Jim, and Tom for this inside look at these recently preserved historical court records and documents relating to enemies of the state. I really appreciate you taking the time today. And for those of you out there who have enjoyed the conversation, you can visit our website at nyarchivestrust.org for more information about this grant project, as well as more information about our upcoming online speaker series events, and also how to subscribe to New York Archives Magazine if you haven't done that already. Thank you so much again to all three of you for a great conversation, and hope to see those of you out there at our next speaker series.